What's going on, reefers? Blaine here. You all know Kevin, who runs the farm here at Top Shelf. Well, Kevin is still a hobbyist at heart and likes to push the boundaries with any of his own personal projects. Today we're going to take a closer look at his unique desktop tank, and if you've ever wondered how an expert coral farmer runs his own system, stay tuned. All right, we are over here in the farm hanging out in Kevin's office, and we're gonna be talking about Kevin's awesome desk tank here. So Kevin, I'm gonna let you take it away and talk about what tank are we talking about here. Obviously it's Innovative Marine, but what size tank is this?
So this is the 30 long, which is a fairly unique dimension as far as just, you know, the general size of it, about 3 foot long, but pretty shallow front to back. Really had to, kind of fit the right tank to fit in this nice little corner spot here on the desk where it wasn't going to overpower things and kind of take away the function of it actually being a desk where I do a lot of work and whatnot. So yeah, it was the perfect tank for that, and it seemed to work out really well. Now, one thing with me is when it comes to setting up tanks, after doing this for so many years, I mean decades, if it's not kind of something that trying new things out, it's hard for me to get too excited about it. So I wanted to try some new things with this setup that I hadn't really done before, and really kind of push things further and experiment. And it's really coming together well. A lot of the things we tried out are working really well, and the coral seems to be real happy and loving life.
Yeah, the tank's looking great. I know you did some modifications to the tank as well. Can you kind of walk us through that process, what you ended up doing? I know you're utilizing the spin nozzles up top, but I see there's a couple more returns coming into the tank at the bottom.
So that was one of the things that I would say is definitely a little more unique, the way I wanted to go about this tank. So, aesthetics wise, you can kind of see, sort of wanted to create kind of a cave environment where you have the rocks suspended from the top coming down, and then the other rocks coming up, where the black background kind of creates that illusion of depth. Even though the aquarium isn't that deep front to back, it really kind of gives the look like it's much bigger than it is, if you can see that in the when you're kind of poking through there. Now, as far as the modifications, we actually went through and whipped out a diamond bit drill and drilled 2 more holes in here. Now, on these tanks, they actually have the acrylic panel, but they're backed with glass. Now, before you drill glass, always check with your manufacturer and make sure it's not tempered, or you're not going to have fun. So, we reached out to them, found that out, and then I went ahead and drilled out first the acrylic part, chipped that out with a little chisel, and then went through the glass part and installed 2 half-inch bulkheads. Now, the main reason for this is I just didn't want to have power heads cluttering up the main display and taking away from the general aesthetic here. Now, doing it with just the regular returns, where it's more of a point source flow, just really wouldn't achieve what we were trying to do in this tank. So that's where putting those extra return nozzles plumbed into the main pump near the bottom, and then extending lock lines behind the rock work, and then angling the returns where they can kind of shoot across more from the sides, really helps get a little bit more random flow in here. And when we're on the topic of random flow, that's the other thing that's great with power heads, but not so great with a return pump. The return pump's pretty much just constant power the whole way, so you don't get that movement, those surges. So that was another challenge that I had to overcome when I was thinking about how to go about this. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of those squid old school wave makers. I mean, you could maybe dig in Craigslist and find some old box of stuff from the 90s, and that's kind of where these things were popular, before a lot of the Vortex were there, and before a lot of these other pumps came in. Are you familiar with those devices?
No, I haven't heard of the squids before, no.
So it's essentially a splitter, a little plastic compartment that attaches to the pump, and then it uses the water flow to turn gears with a diverter valve inside it. So you can split up the 2 returns, and then it'll go one direction and then gradually transition to the other direction. So if you see on this tank, right now we had a surge of water, and then it's slowly transitioning to the other side. So that way the tank gets a little bit more of that back and forth flow. And like you had pointed out, we're incorporating the spin streams from Innovative Marine as well. So those, when the pump kicks over, will actually rotate and divert, in addition to the surge back and forth, the flow in different directions to really kick things around and create more of that random movement. And in addition, the two nozzles on the bottom are tied to that squid too. So those will be pulsing back and forth as well.
Gotcha. So you're kind of creating a nice little tidal surge in here. It looks great. I'm sure people have seen it and they're looking at it, but the scape is very unique. You've done an extremely dynamic scape, as you guys have seen in the Nano tank in the studio. That's mainly where it's got the inspiration from, was this setup and others. So talk us through how you came up with this style of scape and how you decided you wanted to incorporate air plants and kind of take it, like you said, going that next step further. You've done so many tanks over so long, it's kind of taking that next step and pushing the boundary even more.
Yeah, so the air plant idea and the idea where the rocks would be kind of coming down from the top part of the tank were sort of a marriage of two things I tried out at home. So, you know, a tank I had running in my house, 265 gallon, I had built out an Aquascape that had a hanging rock structure where it actually had similar things like this on a larger scale suspended from the top of the aquarium and kind of tied in to where all the power heads were hidden in the rock work. You know, I'll have to show you some pictures and videos of that tank as well. And then kind of building upon that idea as far as using it with the open top where the rock work could still be kind of a part of the Aquascape and a focal point. I had a freshwater tank that I was doing with my son Maximo, and we had done driftwood where I cut slits in it and mounted it on the baffle of an Innovative Marine 50-gallon lagoon tank. And I just really kind of fell in love with that look. The air plants, I'd never really messed with them much, so this was just something new and kind of an additional thing that we worked on and had some fun with. And they seem to do really well on the light, which was another Kessel. So I figured I'd give it a go on this tank. It's a little more of a challenge, being that the desktop here doesn't allow for a suspended light. So currently we're using a blade. I will say that the lighting currently isn't quite where I want it to be as far as the plants go. So I'm thinking about adding either another strip or maybe incorporating some other spotlights into this tank as well. And these guys, are fairly easy to take care of. If you want to remove them from here and dunk them in some fresh water, I usually use aquarium water from my freshwater tank at home. You can do that, or spritzing them frequently with, just a bottle with some aquarium water as well, just to get enough moisture in there and some fertilizer to feed them, a few times a week.
For sure, definitely pushing boundaries with those guys, putting them in an interesting environment they haven't been. It seems like for all the corals in here, you kind of had a plan and an idea when you're creating the scape, where you wanted to kind of place some things. And it seems like you've created some shaded areas and specific areas for some of the corals. What corals are you putting into this tank, and what was the overall idea of what you wanted to do with this system?
So, like I kind of touched on before, the flow in here was a little less easy to just adjust than your typical reef tank, where you have a broad power head and a lot more open areas in the tank. So there are sort of zones in the tank that certain coral will like and certain coral won't like. So that was a bit of a process kind of figuring that out. So usually when I'm doing something like that on a tank, I'll add a handful of tester frags, mount them to different areas of different species, see what's doing really well. And obviously, with experience, you can kind of predict what things you think will do well. Like, let's say this area here gets a nice surge across the front, intermittently, where it's not getting hammered with too much light. I thought, hey, the zoas would really like that spot, which they have. One area over here too, these gonoporas, those guys, really seem to love that intermittent flow as well. As you can see, they kind of, dance with the current, but it's not so constant that they kind of suck in more so and seem to not as be happy. When you get them really flaring out and extended, that's where I know they're really doing well. I've experimented with some of the mushrooms in different areas. That spot is still something I'm fine-tuning because it does have a fairly strong front to back flow here where it kicks back. They didn't seem to really like this spot on the sand bed as much, so I found some zones offset over here where they're doing really well, and I plan on adding a lot more micromusa lords and different things like that, some more LPS to the tank in addition. The areas on the sides here, I have a few zoanthids. They're not quite as happy because the flow in that corner isn't, I think, what they really want to be at. So I'll probably end up moving them elsewhere in the tank and then trying some different stuff in those zones to really see what fits. But that's a big thing with the hobby in general. It's a lot of trial and error and observation. And what's fun with a tank like this is it's so small scale that it's really easy. Just kind of walk up here and observe things and keep an eye on it. So even if you have a big tank at home, one thing I would say is it's great kind of having that exposure to a Nano because it's almost a different way of running a tank. You really get your eyes right on it and look at all the little nooks and crannies in here, and you can kind of analyze things a little further and target feed easier and that sort of thing. So it's been a fun little tank that I play around with every so often while I'm in the office.
Yeah, I think you made a good point. Nano tanks are a great way for people to kind of test out scaling up to a bigger system, testing out different zones and areas. Obviously, this system is very unique with the flow and the patterns. I have to say, did you guys add in any coralline from the farm to get this rolling? Because the coralline growth on the rock is amazing for it to be such a new tank.
Yeah, so to get going here initially, we usually will hard cycle the tank using ammonia or ghost feeding, things like that, to kind of give it a load, and then we make sure that there's a little bit of nitrate and phosphate in there. Once we stop dosing ammonia, where the levels have come down and they're a little more manageable, we'll incorporate copepods, amphipods, put in some natural reproducing cleaner crew like the stomatella snails and colistemas, get them in here. Once the algae starts growing on the rocks, we'll start gradually adding invertebrates as well on top of that, as far as like trocus snails and things. And then fish, gradually adding those, kind of seeing how the tank stabilizes. We don't want to go on a nano tank with too many fish because then you're going to end up pulling your hair out trying to keep the levels in check as far as nitrates and phosphates. One thing we did do in here, and I know the Tang police are going to be all over us on this one, was put a thumbnail size blue hippo tang in here. But realistically, we know that, big tank like this, relative to his size, we'll be able to keep him in here for probably about 6 months and then move him on to another large system that we have here in the farm, and then maybe try another little guy in here to grow out, kind of keep as a pet. But he seems super comfortable zipping around here and, helps with the algae control as well and gets a little more movement. We have a few other unique fish in here, like a fathead anthea and an assessor. Assessors are really neat tanks if you have a lot of overhangs and ledges too, because they'll kind of hang and swim upside down with the rock work, so they can add a unique element to a tank as well.
I saw you had the geometric hawkfish as well. Is that one of those, the pygmy hawkfish?
Yeah, they're great too.
Very cool.
Usually stay away from hawkfish religiously because they can go after small fish and vertebrates a lot more, but those guys are a great tank mate for nanos. They stay small, they're very safe overall. So I got that guy, and then we have a few other fish that we're preparing to go in here by conditioning, getting them eating ahead of time, sometimes running them through copper and treatments like that. So the next addition will be a possum wrasse later this week. Another nice cryptic fish. You may not see them as often, but they're a good pest picker, with planaria and things like that pop up in a lot of reef tanks. So I wanted to get something in there for that kind of control that wasn't going to be very aggressive as far as going after shrimp and things like that once we start adding some more invertebrates in here as well.
Absolutely. I think you have made a couple really good points. You know, there's a lot of fish that sometimes can be something of worry if you're trying to add them to a tank, especially right off the start. If you don't condition them and train them to eat aquarium prepared food and things like that, it could be kind of a struggle. You also made a really good point about the hippo tank. A lot of people will say, oh yeah, that tank's going to move on to an upgrade whenever I have the chance.
Yeah.
But here, obviously, we have so many systems and a lot of water volume where this fish will easily be able to move on and be, you know, cycled in with another smaller tank once that time comes.
Yeah, and when it comes to kind of pushing boundaries with things like that, obviously you want the best thing for that animal long term. So that's why I like to make a point that you can do this, but this is how you do it correctly. And I think people got to understand that, you know, as long as you're willing to actually make that step, take the fish out. I mean, usually your local LFS will take trade-ins and that sort of thing too if you didn't have a larger tank. They would happily take a super healthy blue tang that was grown from a thumbnail size.
For sure. Having a plan definitely is a good idea.
You know, when we throw food in there, they pop up. You know, all these other fish will come out of the woodworks, and you'll see a lot more action in here. You know, we'll probably add maybe a goby or two down the road. And like I said, the other fish that we had mentioned, but that probably will complete this tank.
What are you doing for cleanup crew? So it's obviously a very unique scape, and you're going to need cleanup crew that can get onto that scape and get into those crevices and into those cave areas. What are you doing for the sand bed? What are you doing for cleanup crew overall?
So you made a great observation there. Keeping the rock work clean was a bit of an obstacle in these upper areas here, because obviously there's no way that a hermit crab can get to those top tiers. In this specific scape, there's not really a ladder per se to get them up there. Now I had thought about making a bridge to kind of connect some of these, but I really did like the suspended look. And the more the tank matured, the less issues we were having with the algae on the top. And I ended up putting one urchin in here, a small pincushion urchin. And it cruises around and it seems to find its way onto a lot of these top structures. And then sometimes if I get a little ulva growing on this one suspended one here that it can't get to, I'll just pick him up, drop him right on that rock, and he'll polish it off and clean it up really well. I didn't want to add him right away because, like you had mentioned, that coralline algae takes a little while to get established. So initially I battled the ulva with some emerald crabs, and they polished it off too, but they're a little harder to move up to the different areas than an urchin is. But once the coralline was established, the urchin went in there, and it still gets a really nice coralline look with that appealing, nice purple, until it's all covered with coral, obviously. You know,
Right.
So give it maybe 6 months and you won't be able to see any rock in here, hopefully.
Yeah, that'll
Things
definitely
keep going well.
For sure, that'll be something we'll have to do. We'll have to come back again and definitely do an update down the line once we see this tank. I wanted to hear real quick, and I'm sure everyone else wants to know, what are you running for equipment-wise on the tank? I know you talked about the strip light, but what overall is the equipment that's inside this Nano?
So realistically, the equipment is fairly simple. I would say the backbone of the flow would be a big Seche pump, I think around 700 gallon per hour. Now you think to yourself, that's quite a pump for a tank this size. One thing I would say with what we ended up doing here, you really need an oversized pump, because if you think 700 gallons per hour, well, how much is an MP10 push? I mean, it's in the 2000s up to there. So to really get enough flow throughout this tank, you kind of needed that. Now the squid will reduce your flow slightly as well, and so do the spin streams. So both of those factored into kind of going with the biggest pump I could fit in there. Now, in a perfect world, I would say it'd be even better if I could get a return pump where you could program in a closed loop mode where that could have a little more of a variable flow, which I may try in a top secret future project that I have going on here.
Okay, we'll have to
So
see
we'll
that
touch
soon.
base with that here in the near future. But yeah, that's the main thing there. The blade light. We have a simple Aquatop heater in here, and then a Tunes ATO running in this system, and that's pretty much it. As far as feeding coral, that's one thing I think I'd like to touch on too. In a tank this size, you know, a lot of people get a little afraid of dumping coral foods in there and throwing things off. So with this tank, I was trying to mostly just stick to using Benepets. The good thing about that is because of the probiotics, it tends not to shoot your phosphates up like a lot of the other coral foods can. So that allows me to feed 2-3 times a week in here and target feed some of the stuff without really negatively affecting the water quality much. Another thing to point out, equipment wise and feeding wise, that kind of ties together too, is obviously that pump is very oversized. So you're going to be pushing a lot of water through these overflows. We did switch over to using the custom caddies rather than the filter socks. I would imagine those filter socks would be a nightmare and would clog up really, really quickly and probably over polish the water as well. So with the caddies, we're able to put just a little bit of filter floss where it'll catch a decent amount of the particulate without over polishing things. And then when I feed, I'll just pull the floss out for, you know, a couple hours to about a half an hour sometimes, and then drop it in. And with that frequent turnover and feeding a little bit more frequently as well, I like to clean those filter pads about 3 times a week, which sounds tedious, but literally just grab a little cup, grab them, go to the sink, swish them off a little bit, drop them right back in. It takes less than 5 minutes each time. And that'll remove a lot of the waste that they're collecting before it has a chance to break down and really add to the nitrate and phosphate in the system. So we don't have to go crazy with water changes. I do try to stick to a pretty good schedule with that as well. And again, little tank, quick and easy. You know, 5 minutes, knock out a water change in here every, every couple weeks or so, depending on what the water's testing at.
Gotcha. I think you made, once again, a lot of really good points with nanos. You know, some people think that taking care of a saltwater fish tank is a lot of work, right? And you made great mention that sometimes it takes about 5 minutes and you're in and out and done with working with this tank. So I think the system looks amazing. You've done a great job. I love the scape. I love what you're doing with the corals, and I can't wait to come back and check out this tank here in the future and get an update with it. Any last remarks about the system before we kind of sign off here?
Well, not really. I mean, outside of just saying, yeah, I'd love to see people continuing to try to push the boundaries of what we're doing in this hobby and, you know, really experimenting and trying new things. I think that, you know, sometimes you just want a tank that's plug and play and works perfectly the first time. But, you know, there was some trial and error that went into this, and, you know, that's part of the hobby too. It's like people who, you know, are messing with cars, you know, you want to kind of tune it and tweak this and modify that. You know, you can kind of take that mentality with the build and the equipment, even on a nano tank, not just on a elaborate, in-wall setup with a fish room and all that. You know, you can kind of really incorporate that mentality on the small scale.
For sure. Yeah, so like you guys have seen today, if you guys like any of these kind of corals, the coral line, the cleanup crew, even the custom rockscape, reach out to us, send us a message. We can help you out and we'll hook you up with a bunch of amazing stuff. If you guys have hung out all the way through, I want to say thank you so much. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification so you don't miss out on any future uploads.